Hey guys, tonight we will quietly step into the darkest corridors of Tudor England, where the echoes of the sword still resound in the stones of the Tower of London. Imagine the atmosphere of a cold night, the flickering torchlight, and a crowd holding its breath as Anne Boleyn, a queen, a lover, a political storm, kneels before the cruelest sentence in history. You may think you are ready, but trust me, you will not survive if you assume the truths ahead are just gentle fairy tales. Because what we are about to uncover is not one, not two, but 102 shocking and strange facts about Anne Boleyn, the queen who was destroyed, yet the woman who refused to disappear from humanity's memory. So, before you relax, take a second to hit like on the video and subscribe to the channel, but only if you truly enjoy what I am doing here. And don't forget to leave a comment to let me know where are you watching from, and what time is it where you live. Now then, turn off most of the lights. Maybe turn on a fan to hear the gentle background wind. And together let's slowly drift into tonight's journey. Fact number 1. The Queen's secret hand. You are sitting in the gentle darkness, and try to imagine the hand of a queen. Normally, we think of long, slender fingers, adorned with ruby rings, emeralds, or diamonds sparkling on a flickering candlelight. But for Anne Boleyn, that hand carried a secret. The whole court would never forget: an extra finger. Yes, you heard that right. Rumor had it that Anne had 6 fingers on her right hand. Not a tiny, cute bonus finger, but one clear enough that she had to hide it all her life. In court portraits, you will often see Anne standing with her hands tightly clasped, sometimes folded before her stomach, sometimes hidden in wide sleeves. That was not only the gentle pose of a Tudor lady, but also her way of keeping the world from seeing what she believed to be her fatal flaw. And of course, enemies never missed an opportunity. In an age when a mole could be called the devil's mark, what would an extra finger be but proof straight from hell? The Spanish envoys, who hated Anne to the bone because she had stolen the throne from Catherine of Aragon, a Spanish princess, immediately spread the rumor across Europe. The Queen of England has the hand of the devil. Chilling. Like a horror movie poster you'd see at the theatre today. But pause for a moment. You and I both know these descriptions may not be true. Modern historians still argue. Some insist Anne never has 6 fingers, that all those tales were fabrications meant to slander her. Yet whether true or not did not matter to people of the time. For 16th century folk, rumor held as much power as reality. If the whole village believed you were a witch, then even if you only knew how to cook porridge, they would still be ready to pile wood at your feet. Picture the scene at a banquet in Whitehall Palace. Ladies in splendid gowns, gentlemen with well-groomed beards, everyone holding glasses of French wine shimmering under candlelight. Into this space, Anne walked, crown gleaming, a white pearl necklace around her neck, all bowed. But when she raised her glass to toast, a few sly eyes fixed on her hand. A whisper spread like wind. The 6th finger, I saw it, whether real or not. That seed of doubt was enough to ruin the flawless image of a queen. You might smile and think, so what? Having an extra finger might even make her better at playing the lute or cards. But remember, this was the Tudor court, where a frown could cost you your head. For Anne, 6 fingers were no joke. It was a death sentence hanging overhead, always ready to be used as evidence of witchcraft or evil whenever Henry VIII flew into rage. Interestingly, some records also mention Anne had a tooth that protruded from her lower lip, meaning that besides the devil's finger, she also had the beast's smile. Imagine an enemy, Hunt, gleefully writing to Rome, "The Queen of England has a mouth wide as a church door, with a tooth jutting out like a wolf's fang." With just a few lines, they turned a clever, charming woman into a figure straight from a grim fairy tale. Yet the irony is all those venomous descriptions only prove Anne's extraordinary magnetism, because if she were just an ordinary woman, who would care about her hand or her tooth? It was precisely because Anne made Henry VIII so infatuated he abandoned the Pope, broke with Rome, and changed the religion of an entire nation, that her enemies had to seize on even the smallest details to tarnish her. And perhaps Anne herself understood this well. She did not let gossip crush her. Instead, she turned insecurity into a cunning weapon. Each time she appeared in public, she chose outfits refined to every fold. French-style fashionable hair, graceful poses to conceal her hand, forcing all eyes to focus on her poise rather than flaws. People say that in conversation, Anne's eyes seemed to smile. Her voice was melodious. Sometimes she even sang softly to enchant her listeners. It was this intelligence and charm that made Henry VIII restless. Not outward appearance. Maybe her hand was not perfect, but her mind was sharper than any sword in the royal arsenal. If you think deeper, this truth reveals a greater tragedy. It shows how harsh society was on women. A man with 6 fingers, people might say, oh, destiny marked him as special. But a woman with 6 fingers, instantly, she was the devil's mark. A witch. It was the game of power, where gender decided survival, and for that reason, the rumors about Anne became fuel feeding the storm that would sweep her to the scaffold. The image of a queen with an extra finger, a jutting tooth, a strange figure, was used by her enemies as proof she was not a normal human, but possessed by demons. And when a reason was needed to behead a queen, what could be more convenient than such signs? Imagine, on a cold night at the Tower of London, Anne looking at her hand under dim candlelight, 6 fingers, or 5. Perhaps she herself wondered, is this a curse or a mark of destiny? That finger had followed her since birth, and in the end, also helped lead her to a tragic fate. If you are listening now, perhaps you feel a chill. But remember, sometimes what frightens us most are not demons in the dark, but human eyes always ready to turn a tiny difference into a death sentence. And for Anne Boleyn, this first fact is the most vivid proof of all. Fact number 2, the Queen's controversial beauty. You are lying still, hearing the steady turn of the fan, and perhaps in your mind you are painting an image of Anne Boleyn, as in the movies, a stunning woman. Sharp eyes, glossy black hair, walking regally through the Tudor palace. But the truth was very different. For centuries, Anne has often been thought of as a beauty icon, a femme fatale of the 16th century. But if you look back at diplomatic letters, reports from foreign envoys, you will see a picture far less flattering. A Venetian envoy once wrote, "She is not one of the beautiful. Her skin is sallow, her breasts are small, and her neck is too long." And a Spanish ambassador bluntly said, "She has only one attractive feature, her seductive eyes. Nothing else." After hearing that, you might be tempted to ask, so what exactly did Henry VIII see in her? Imagine Henry, a king who could choose any beauty from within or outside the kingdom, pouring out his throne, his nation, to marry a woman described as a crane's neck, a wide mouth, a pale complexion. It sounds absurd, but that was precisely Anne's uniqueness. Her power did not lie in outward beauty, but in intellect and inner presence. Put yourself in the Tudor court. The ladies and noblewomen spent their days on dresses, makeup, dancing, embroidery. Meanwhile, Anne, a woman who had lived in France, educated properly, dared to debate theology, philosophy, even dared to counter the king's opinion with graceful sharpness. Henry had never met anyone like that. He had hundreds of pretty flowers in his household, but only Anne dared to turn herself into a flame, not just to shine, but strong enough to burn down an entire church. Interestingly, because Anne was not too beautiful, she made a longer-lasting impression. An imperfect face often imprints more strongly in memory. People would remember the wide mouth, the long neck, the eyes that always seemed to hold a secret. It created something unusual, a personal brand that no one could mistake. If you have ever met someone not conventionally beautiful, yet strangely magnetic, then you understand why Henry VIII could not take his eyes off Anne. Of course, enemies used this to attack her. In pamphlets spread across London, Anne was drawn with devil's horns, a bloated belly, and a twisted face. These caricatures sold like hotcakes. Children could buy them to hang as playthings, and priests used them right in church sermons. Behold, the one who shook the throne of God. Her controversial beauty became evidence that she was the witch who seduced the king. Yet on the other hand, Anne knew how to use her unusual looks. She did not try to become a Tudor beauty queen, which was impossible anyway. Instead, she built her own style, always wearing low-cut French gowns. A necklace with the bold letter B across her chest. Forcing people to remember her, she often chose daring colors: deep red, emerald green, midnight purple, shades both striking and mysterious. This was no longer natural beauty, but the art of decorating oneself as a symbol. Notice, even today we are often more drawn to people with their own vibe, rather than perfection. A girl whose face is not outstanding, but who knows how to dress, how to speak, how to carry herself, can still mesmerize. Anne Boleyn was ahead of her time in this. She understood that in a court full of flowers, to survive, you must be the flame, and a flame does not need to be beautiful, only to burn long and bright. Looking deeper, Anne being called not beautiful also reflects the cultural contradictions of the age. Italians admired darker skin. The French preferred golden hair. The Spanish valued full, wholesome faces. Anne, pale-skinned, dark-haired, slender, did not fit any of those standards. So in the eyes of foreign envoys, she was nothing special. But for Henry, her difference felt fresh. And in love or lust, freshness sometimes matters more than standards. Saying broadly, this second fact teaches us a lesson. Power does not always come from beauty. Anne Boleyn may not have been beautiful by the standards of her time, yet she still captivated the most powerful king in Europe. What Henry adored was not only her expressive eyes, but also her intellect, her grace, and the way she dared to say no for 7 years, driving him mad with desire. You see, controversial beauty was never a weakness. For Anne, it was a mirror of her strategy. She did not need to be a perfect flower, only the flame no one could extinguish. And that flame, in the end, consumed the relationship between England and the Pope, paving the way for the English Reformation. How ironic that it was a woman who was not beautiful, who changed the face of Europe. Fact number 3. The abandoned sister. Anne Boleyn's lesson of survival. Have you ever heard the saying, the one who goes first clears the path? The one who comes later reaps the harvest. For the Boleyn family, that saying could almost have been written as family law, because before Anne Boleyn became the center of the Tudor court, the one lingering in the arms of King Henry VIII was her elder sister, Mary Boleyn. Picture it: a banquet at Greenwich Palace, candles flickering on red wine, musicians playing gentle lute melodies, and near the throne, Mary Boleyn sat, golden hair shining, cheeks flushed, a shy smile on her lips. Henry VIII, then in the full vigor of youth, strong as a gladiator and fiery as a summer storm, leaned toward her with a smile. That look was enough for everyone in the hall to understand this girl had just been chosen as the king's official mistress. Mary Boleyn was not the first girl Henry noticed, but she was one of the few whose relationship was made public. Rumors spread fast. Mary had once served as a lady-in-waiting in France, where she had connections with many nobles, enough to earn her the scornful nickname English Mare. Don't blush. In the French court, man to woman many knights had ridden, a nickname cruel enough to ruin a woman's honor in an instant. But Henry VIII did not care. He was notoriously undiscerning, and so Mary quickly became his mistress, showered with gold, land, and even the special favor of bearing him at least one child. Some say two. Though the king never officially recognized them, the entire court knew well. The story might have ended like any other of Henry's affairs. If not for Anne, the younger sister watching everything from the shadows. Anne witnessed firsthand how Mary was swept into the whirlpool of power and discarded when her value ran out. In her youth, Mary had shone, courted by both king and French nobles. But once Henry grew bored, she became a worn-out toy, abandoned without pity. No throne, no title, no glory, only a ruined reputation and memories no one wished to recall. Imagine a grey morning at Whitehall Palace. Mary, now just a tired woman, sat quietly by the window. Outside, Henry revelled with new beauties, while she was forgotten in the dark. To Anne, that image was like a warning carved into her heart. If you let yourself fall into a king's hands as an easy gift, your fate will be the same as your sister's, abandoned, forgotten, erased from royal memory. So Anne chose a completely different path. If Mary gave Henry everything at once, Anne would give him nothing. Mary was a short-term mistress, but Anne was determined to become queen. Do you see the cunning? For 7 years, as Henry pursued her, Anne played the game of giving but not giving, allowing hand-holding, kisses, even semi-public flirtations. But she resolutely withheld the final thing. Imagine Henry, a king used to instant gratification, forced to wait 7 years. That was what drove him mad with desire. To put it a bit wryly, Mary was like a sweet pastry, delicious but quickly cloying. Anne turned herself into rare wine. The longer kept, the more intoxicating. And Henry, a man who never knew patience, fell straight into the trap. Yet it is only fair to Mary. Though called the English Mare, she was no fool. In the few letters and records that survive, Mary appears gentle, easily used, and somewhat naive. Perhaps she never realized that love at court was a life-and-death chess game. When discarded, Mary chose to retreat and live a quiet life, rather than risk everything clinging to the throne like her sister. And that choice, ironically, saved her from the executioner's block later on. Look closely, and this third fact reveals layers of tragedy. It shows how noble women were mere commodities in the political market. Their father, Thomas Boleyn, did not stop it. On the contrary, he encouraged his daughters to become the king's offerings, an investment in the family's future. To him, love, honor, or happiness mattered less than a seat of power at court. Mary was the first product sold, and Anne was the deluxe edition kept for the right time. And here, you might sigh like father, like daughters, for that ambition threw both sisters into a pit with no escape. Mary was abandoned. Anne was beheaded. A family that thought it was climbing to power's peak was in truth only throwing its daughters into the lion's mouth. The story of Mary and Anne also echoes today's reality. How many still believe beauty or charm is the shortest path upward? But the price is always terrible once your value is gone. You are replaced. Just like Mary Boleyn, Anne learned that lesson early, and she decided to make herself an irreplaceable commodity. Though in the end, Henry proved nothing was truly safe in the hands of a fickle king. You see, sometimes survival lessons do not come from books, but from a relative's tragedy. Mary was the painful example that taught Anne, if you are only a mistress, you will be quickly forgotten. To endure, you must become queen. And with Henry VIII, That meant overturning religion, a nation, and all of Europe. Without Mary Boleyn, perhaps there would have been no Anne Boleyn as we know her. It was from her sister's silent sacrifice that Anne found her path, a path paved with roses, blood, and the sword. Fact number 4. The father who traded his daughter's bodies, Thomas Boleyn, and the family gamble. Have you ever thought that parents might give birth to children only to turn them into merchandise, to exchange for power? It sounds cruel. But for the Boleyns, that was the raw truth. Thomas Boleyn, father of Mary and Anne, was no minor noble. He was a shrewd statesman, an experienced diplomat, sent to France, to the Habsburgs, even trusted at times by Henry VIII. People praised his intellect, his languages, his skill in negotiation. But beneath that exterior, Thomas was a notorious gambler in the political game, and his two most valuable cards were his own daughters. Imagine a small room in Hever Castle, the fire blazing in the hearth. Thomas sat at an oak table. Before him, his two teenage daughters. He did not speak like a normal father, saying, "Live happily, find true love." No, he gave stern instructions. You must know how to stand so the king notices. You must know how to smile so that your face shines, but not seem too easy. You must know when to step back, when to let others think they can almost touch you. It sounded like a model training session, Tudor style. But the target was not a catwalk. It was the throne of England. Thomas Boleyn knew well the harsh rules of court. The beauty and allure of women were commodities that could be traded for power. With Mary, he chose the strategy of early release. The elder daughter was sent to France, tested in the world of glitter, and as you already know from fact number 3, Mary soon became Henry's mistress. For Thomas, it was like a product test to see how far the family's card could go. When Mary was cast aside, Thomas did not falter. On the contrary, he turned to a bigger bet with Anne. If Mary was the appetizer, Anne would be the main course. This time, Thomas decided not to sell cheap, but to make his daughter into a rare luxury. He urged Anne to keep herself, not give in easily, to use distance to fuel Henry's hunger, a strategy we might today call scarcity marketing. Picture Anne in her teens, trained by her father in every detail, how to hold a wine cup gracefully, how to keep her knees demure yet alluring, how to use her eyes to draw someone in, and then turn away to leave a gap. Small gestures, but deadly weapons in a court full of prying eyes. You might laugh and say, "What a strange father." But for Thomas, it was survival strategy. In an age where crowns, land, and honor could be bartered through marriage or affairs, daughters were the chess pieces on the board. You could even say Thomas Boleyn was a manager in every sense. While Mary and Anne were the performers on the royal stage, the bitter truth is, this upbringing made both girls grow up in a world of calculation. Anne learned early love was not private, but a contract. A smile was not an expression, but a bargaining tool. A touch was not intimacy, but currency for land, titles, or even a crown. And that explains why Anne was unlike Tudor women of her time. While they were shy, waiting to be arranged, Anne acted. She knew when to deny Henry to inflame him, when to soothe his anger with tenderness. Those skills were not born naturally. They were trained in the silent lessons of an ambitious father. But every gamble has its price. Thomas Boleyn may have smiled with satisfaction when his daughter became Queen of England. But that smile froze when the sword fell. The day Anne was beheaded, Thomas did not dare protest. All the land and titles he had traded for his daughter's blood crumbled into dust. The father who manipulated the fates of his two daughters ended his life in loneliness and regret. Close your eyes, and you might picture Thomas, old, in a cold room of Hever Castle, sitting silently before a dead hearth. No, more diplomatic letters. No more maps of power. Only painful memories. Perhaps he whispered into the night, "I was wrong, all wrong." But history never gave him a chance to undo it. So this fourth fact does not only expose a ruthless father, but also a broader truth in the Tudor court. Women, even princesses or queens, were often just tools in men's hands. Thomas Boleyn did nothing more than follow the rules of the game of his age. But the price was so terrible that centuries later, when people speak of the Boleyns, they remember the two doomed daughters more than the once glorious father. Do you see how tragic it is? That both Mary and Anne were swept into this spiral. Mary abandoned, Anne beheaded. And behind both tragedies stood the figure of a father who treated his daughters as chess pieces for power. By now, perhaps you sigh, but in that sigh is a lesson ambition may take you very high. But if it is built on the bodies and blood of your own kin, the price paid will not fall on you alone. It will crush the whole family. Fact number 5. 12 years old in the furnace of France. When Anne learned survival, close your eyes and imagine you are only 12. Just torn from your family's embrace. Not yet understanding the world, and suddenly placed on a ship across the sea. Straight into a foreign court. For Anne Boleyn, that was France, admired by all Europe for its glitter, refinement, and artistic brilliance. But don't be fooled by the shine. The French court was no paradise. It was a boiling cauldron where power, désir, and intrigue never stopped seething. Anne was sent there to serve Queen Claude, wife of Francois, a king famous for being both charming and debauched. People called the French court a boarding school for nobles. But in reality, it was a brutal furnace. The clever survived. The naive were swept away like petals sinking into mud. As a lady-in-waiting, Anne had to learn every rule: how to stand with hands folded behind her back, how to pour wine without spilling, how to bow with a blend of reverence and grace. But those rules were only the surface. The real lessons lay in what the 12-year-old girl witnessed each day. At that age, Anne should have been playing, learning letters, embroidering, singing country songs. Instead, she saw scenes that would chill any child. Beautiful maids constantly pursued, even forced. But powerful men. Many lost their honor in a single night. Pregnant in silence. Cast out from court, ruined and forgotten. Picture one night at Amboise. Anne lay on a small wooden bed, while her roommate, dragged off at a feast, returned with tearful eyes and a torn gown. Sobs echoed in the dark. Anne, barely 13, clutched her blanket, heart pounding, engraving into memory, "I must learn to protect myself, or one day I will become like them." From moments like these, Anne began sharpening her wits. She learned to dodge dangerous gazes, to smile in refusal without offense, to keep enough distance not to be despised, yet not swallowed whole. Every day in the French court was like walking a tightrope. One misstep could shatter her life. But not everything was dark. In France, Anne absorbed Europe's cultural treasures. She mastered French, became familiar with Latin literature, learned dance, song, refined conversation. As a teenager, she was transformed into an exotic bloom. Unlike any English girl her age, people said it was those years that gave Anne her French grace, the weapon that later bewitched Henry VIII. Yet Anne did not only study music or fashion, she observed politics. When nobles discussed treaties, wars, or religious reforms, Anne, though only a small maid, listened quietly. She memorized how they argued, how they used logic to persuade. She understood that true power lay not in beauty, but in intellect and mastery of words. Historians often recall one image: Anne, 14, sitting by a castle window, holding a French book, eyes intent, while other girls laughed and played outside. She was not a bookworm in the modern sense. She had simply realized knowledge was the only armor for survival, in a world where women were men's toys. And indeed, what Anne learned in France became the foundation for facing Henry VIII. Without that harsh childhood, perhaps Anne would have been another Mary, a mistress discarded. Never a queen. But remember, the lesson of France was not all roses. It planted in Anne a deep suspicion. She knew women could be discarded at any time. Love could vanish in a night. And the only safety was control. Control of herself, of others, even of the king. That mindset turned Anne from a fragile girl into a woman of ambition, daring to defy the Pope himself. When she returned to England in 1522, Anne was no longer innocent. She was a product of the French furnace, sharp, graceful, calculating. Every step, every smile, every word was deliberate. And it all began at 12, the age when she had to grow faster than other children. In a court where women were both ornaments and prey, perhaps you feel pity for that little girl. But it was from that pain that Anne forged the steel which carried her into history, even if the path ended at the scaffold. Fact number 6. When women were only breathing ornaments in the French court, imagine an afternoon in the dazzling palace of King Francois. Sunlight slants through towering stained glass windows, reflected on tiled floors. Powerful men sit in rows, their long cloaks shimmering with gold embroidery, while the ladies, adorned with jewels and painted faces, stand behind them like living statues. Anne Boleyn, then just a young maid of honor, stood quietly in a corner, watching it all, and she realized a cruel truth here. Women were no different from pearl necklaces or crystal vases, breathing ornaments, displayed to beautify the court, always ready to be locked away in storage once they were out of fashion. At lavish banquets, Francoise's consorts were paraded like fashions on display. Those chosen stepped forward in brocade gowns, pearls at their necks, radiant smiles on their faces. But behind the brilliance lay a harsh reality. They were luxury toys to feed the pride of the king and his nobles. Anne saw women shining in the morning, only to be replaced by nightfall. Some, when no longer pleasing, were expelled in disgrace. Others fared worse, dying in childbirth, or simply forgotten, their names erased. Can you imagine Anne's feelings barely in her teens? Yet sharp enough to understand beauty was like a coin, bright when newly struck, but dull after a few hands, and once worthless, no one bothered to pick it up. It was in France that Anne learned a vital lesson. Power built on beauty alone is fleeting. No matter how lovely, you are just a flower, blooming one season, then withering. But with intellect and strength, you can be a seed, able to sprout again and again. Perhaps that is why Anne began to stand out. She did not only tend to her looks, she read books, learned languages, listened as men debated politics. While other girls focused on powders and gowns, Anne was absorbing every word of diplomatic discussions. Later, this made her one of the few women able to converse with Henry VIII not only about love, but about theology, reform, and law. But don't think Anne was unaffected by the heartbreak she witnessed. On the contrary, she carved it deep in her soul. Each time she saw a lady fall from favor, she whispered to herself, "I will never allow myself to be discarded like that. If I must enter this game, I will set the rules, not play the victim." One story is often told. One of Francois' mistresses once entered a banquet in triumph, adored by the court. Months later, she died in childbirth, blood staining the bed, and no one bothered to carve her a tombstone. When Anne heard the news, she did not weep, but her eyes darkened. In that moment, She understood a woman who relies only on beauty will be swallowed by power's game. Yet out of pain, Anne learned how to master the stage. She saw that the wiser a woman appeared, the more she knew when to advance and when to retreat. The longer her influence lasted, a little mystery, a little refusal, a touch of wit. These mattered far more than any pretty face. Look closely, and you see Anne as an artist learning her craft from suffering itself. Her years in France made her a master performer, able to make men desire her without ever surrendering, able to let them believe they were chasing her, while in truth, they were being led. And it all began with what she saw in the French court, women as ornaments, blazing briefly, then vanishing without a trace. Had Anne not been there, perhaps she would have remained just another ordinary Boleyn girl. But that world of glamour laced with cruelty taught her how to become a premium rarity no one dared to dismiss. A woman who, even when beheaded, still made all of Europe tremble at her influence. Do you see how strange it is that tragedies so often forge not only the great, but at least those who can never be forgotten? Fact number 7. The mysterious bloodline from her mother, Elizabeth Howard. If you think Anne Boleyn was merely the daughter of a middling noble family, pause for a moment. Behind her lies a centuries-old rumor, centered on her mother, Elizabeth Howard, a woman history records little of prosyness, but whose fragments of story are enough to shroud her in mystery. Elizabeth Howard came from the powerful Howard family, one of the greatest houses of England. Her father was Thomas Howard, the second Duke of Norfolk, a famed warrior who had served multiple kings. In other words, Elizabeth was not a trivial noblewoman, but the daughter of a dynasty that had often stood close to the throne. And here is where the rumors begin. Some historians believe Elizabeth Howard may have been an illegitimate daughter of King Edward IV, the Yorkist monarch, father of princesses, Elizabeth and Mary, and grandfather of the little king, Edward V. Imagine if that were true. Anne Boleyn would not only be the daughter of a calculating diplomat, but also the granddaughter of an English king. That meant she carried royal blood, though never officially acknowledged. In Tudor times, such a rumor was as dangerous as an indictment. If Anne bore York blood, she could be seen as a political threat. To her enemies, it was the perfect excuse to paint her not just as a seductress of the king, but as a woman with ambitions for the throne through blood right. But you know, whether true or not, the rumor may have nurtured in Anne a deep inner belief that she was destined for more than an ordinary role. From childhood, she grew up where people whispered behind her back, "That girl may be a descendant of King Edward IV." And when you are raised on whispers like that, you start to see the world differently. You begin to think, perhaps I was not born for an ordinary life. Perhaps my fate is the crown. Picture Anne of 15, in the library of Hever Castle, turning the pages of a Latin book, eyes lingering on the names in royal genealogies. She read Edward IV, then listened to stories her mother told of her childhood at court, piece by piece, rumor by rumor, all formed in the young girl's mind. A certainty she had the right to dream of the throne. That is why, when Henry VIII offered her the position of official mistress, a role many women would have leapt at, Anne firmly refused, because she believed the blood in her veins forbade her from being merely a mistress. That blood demanded she become queen. Interestingly, Anne's enemies also weaponized this rumor. At her trial in 1536, several accusations hinted that Anne always harbored ambitions for the crown, that she did not accept being a wife, but dreamed of overthrowing monarchy itself to restore York blood. One record even bluntly stated, Anne Boleyn considered herself the descendant of Edward IV, and so saw Henry only as a pawn to achieve her goal. You might laugh and say, all political fabrication. True, but in a court where even a birthmark could be branded the devil's mark, A rumor of royal blood was more than enough to make Anne a potential danger. This also explains Anne's burning ambition. As a maid of honor, she did not just care about gowns and manners. She studied languages, theology, literature, to prove she was different. If her mother truly bore York blood, then Anne was its continuation, a small but unyielding branch, fighting to grow toward the light of the crown. Imagine her in her final days, imprisoned in the Tower of London. She may have thought of the rumor about her mother. Perhaps, in her heart, she told herself, if I truly bear Edward's blood, then this is the price it must pay. The York fate is forever bound to blood, and the sword, meaning that even as she prepared for the scaffold, Anne carried the shadow of a dynasty that never escaped tragedy. Fact number 7. Therefore, is not just a story of bloodlines. It also explains why Anne never accepted a common life. The blood, whether true or imagined, made her a woman who always believed she was born to be different. And it was that very belief that carried her to the heights, then hurled her into the abyss. Do you see, sometimes a single rumor is enough to change an entire life? For Anne, the rumor about her mother was not merely a tale of genealogy, but a hidden flame burning in her heart, guiding her into the game of power, and ultimately, leading her to the scaffold. Fact number 8. The Boleyn family motto, whatever I wish, I command. When you hear the words, whatever I wish, I command, you might picture a Roman emperor or an Eastern tyrant. Right. But no, this was the motto of the Boleyn family, an English noble house, not of the highest rank, yet remembered for its blazing ambition. To understand how important this motto was, you need to picture Tudor society. Early 16th century England was a giant chessboard, where every noble family sought to climb higher. They competed not only for land or titles, but also for family crests and their accompanying mottos. A motto was not just for show, it was a public oath. This is our essence, our mission, and the Boleyns chose a boldly arrogant line, whatever I wish, I command. Imagine Anne grew up in a household where walls, medals, even family rings bore this motto. Each time she lifted her eyes to see it, she was reminded, I was not born to accept what others grant. I was born to want and to make my wants into commands. This motto helped shape Anne's character: proud, daring, and at times dangerously headstrong. Anne and the right to want. In Tudor society, women were not allowed to want. They were taught to be obedient, to wait for men to decide their fate. But Anne was different. From a young age, her father, Thomas Boleyn, exposed her to French culture and Renaissance humanism. She read Erasmus, knew of Thomas More. I heard reformers speak of individual freedom, and combined with her family motto, Anne drew her own truth. Even a woman has the right to want and to make her wants reality. That is why Anne dared to refuse Henry VIII when he only wanted her as a mistress. An ordinary girl might have rejoiced at royal favor, but not Anne. She thought, if I want to be queen, then that is what I will be. And so she stepped back, forcing Henry into frenzy, driving him to break an entire lawful marriage to Catherine of Aragon in order to marry her. You may think Anne reckless, but in truth, she was only living out her family creed, whatever I wish. I command, the dark side of the motto, but there was tragedy. That motto also planted in Anne a dangerous illusion that everything she wanted was within her control. And as you know, in a Tudor court full of enemies, no one could truly command everything. Anne wanted a son, but her first child was Elizabeth. She wanted more births to secure the throne, but 2 miscarriages shattered the dream. She wanted lasting power, but only a few years after her coronation, she was kneeling before a tribunal, accused of adultery and treason. Perhaps, in her last days in the Tower of London, Anne thought again of that family motto, "Whatever I wish, I command." Yet now, what she wished was simply to live, and even that was beyond her reach. How ironic that the motto lifted her to glory, but also ensured her fall was harder than anyone's. The influence on Elizabeth I. What is fascinating is that the legacy of the Boleyn family motto did not die with Anne. Her daughter, Elizabeth I, may well have absorbed its spirit. Throughout her 45-year reign, Elizabeth consistently showed an independent, proud nature, unwilling to let anyone dictate her life. When Parliament urged her to marry to produce an heir, she coolly declared, "I am already bound unto a husband, which is the kingdom of England." Doesn't that sound like whatever I wish? I command. But in Elizabeth, the motto was transformed into something wiser, more flexible. If Anne lived like a flame that blazed fiercely and then burned out, Elizabeth learned to keep the fire steady for decades. The motto, a mirror of ambition. Looking back, the Boleyn family motto can be seen as a mirror, reflecting the ambitions of the Tudor age. It captured the hunger of a family not among the highest nobility, yet determined to rise. And in Anne, it created a woman bold enough to challenge social order, to demand a crown, to demand exclusive love from a king. The intriguing question is, without that motto, would Anne have dared to enter such a perilous game? Perhaps she would have accepted the role of mistress, living comfortably in the shadows, dying, wealthy, but with "whatever I wish, I command" burning in her heart. She chose another path, one that carved her name into history. Fact number 9. Anne Boleyn, the silent queen of reform. When you think of the English Reformation, the first name to appear is surely Henry VIII, the obese. Volatile king, notorious for divorcing 6 wives. But the truth is subtler. Behind that earth-shattering break, England's split from the Roman Catholic Church, was a soft but determined hand, Anne Boleyn. Not a theologian, not a cleric, Anne nonetheless became the silent queen of reform, planting in the king's mind ideas that would change history. From her youth, Anne was sent to France, where Renaissance and humanism flourished. There she encountered dangerous books, banned in England vernacular Bibles, Martin Luther's writings, William Tyndale's tracts. In London, possession of such texts could mean hanging or burning. But in France, they reached Anne like open doors to another world, one where people could read God's word directly, without pope or priest as gatekeeper. Anne never became an open reformer. She never wrote a manifesto like Luther, nor preached from pulpits. But she did something more subtle. She planted those ideas in Henry VIII's heart. In private conversations, when Henry asked about faith, Anne gently steered him to believe that breaking with Rome was not merely to marry her, but a righteous act to give his people closer access to God. It is said Anne often gave Henry small books bound in rich leather, with passages carefully marked. One of these was The Obedience of a Christian Man by William Tyndale, a work claiming that kings, not popes, were the supreme spiritual heads within their realms. When Henry read it, he exclaimed, "This is my treasure." And from then, the idea that he could be supreme head of the Church of England took root. Anne went further than advising Henry. She built a circle of reform around herself. Her ladies and servants were chosen carefully, many sympathetic to reformist thought. They read, they discussed, they shared forbidden pages of Luther and Tyndale like smouldering coals, waiting to ignite. Yet note the paradox. Anne never called herself a Lutheran, and she retained much of Catholic devotion. She believed in prayer, in Mass, and sometimes observed traditional rites. But she also believed the Church needed reform, a return to Scripture, a stripping away of corruption and extravagance. In short, Anne was no extremist. She was a bridge, linking the old Catholic world with the new Reformation. This made her both admired and despised. Priests loyal to Rome painted her as a Jezebel, the temptress who lured the king from the church, but reformers saw her as a beacon, proof that even a queen could shield reform in secret. And then, when Anne fell, accused of adultery and treason, executed at the scaffold, the propaganda thundered. Enemies claimed it was God's punishment on a blasphemous woman, but reformers whispered she had not died in vain. For the seed she planted in Henry had sprouted. He still bore the title, Supreme Head of the Church of England. And Elizabeth, her daughter, later became the monarch who cemented Anglicanism, an independent faith still alive today. You can see, Anne did not need a secure throne to become immortal, even buried beneath waves of accusations and hatred. She endured in the pages of the English Bible, later allowed to be read, in the Anglican churches that rose, and in the very spiritual legacy her daughter Elizabeth continued. Perhaps, if she could look back from eternity, Anne would smile, because she would know that though her body was struck down, the seeds of reform she planted grew, spread across England, and changed the fate of millions. A silent queen of reform. That is the shocking yet beautiful truth about Anne Boleyn. Fact number 10. Anne Boleyn, the woman who turned royal love into a battle of passion and power. Before Anne Boleyn appeared, royal marriages were nothing more than dry political chess. Kings married to secure alliances, to gain territory, to bring in rich dowries. And as for love, that was a luxury, usually relegated to discreet affairs with mistresses or courtesans. But Anne Boleyn did something unprecedented. She transformed love into a weapon, and that love shook the throne of England. When Henry VIII began to notice Anne, he already had a wife, Catherine of Aragon, a proud Spanish princess who had shared nearly 2 decades with him and borne him a daughter. For any dynasty, that was enough to keep the royal family steady. But for Henry, one thing was missing: a male heir. Obsessed with producing a son to continue his line, Henry looked at Anne not only with the eyes of a man in love, but with the conviction that destiny had sent him the mother of future kings. Anne was unlike any woman at court. While Henry's previous mistresses yielded quickly, Anne created distance. She refused to share his bed, skillfully planting in Henry's heart a feeling that was both desire and challenge. Each letter Henry wrote to her was a sigh of infatuation, yet also a plea. The man who held the lives of millions now humbled himself to write, "I beg you, do not make me wait any longer." This was an inversion unprecedented in history. A king, the center of all desire, became the pursuer, and Anne, daughter of a middling noble house, I knew how to wield this as a card of power. Through love, or at least the appearance of it, Anne drove Henry to dare what none had before: defy the Pope, break the alliance with Spain, ignite a religious earthquake across Europe. Think of it, just to marry Anne, Henry abandoned the spiritual throne of Rome. That proved love here was no mere private emotion, but a colossal political weapon, powerful enough to tear apart ancient order. Of course, this made Anne hated by all. Commoners saw her as the seductress who led their king into division. Nobles whispered that she was the witch who unhinged Henry. Clerics denounced her openly as a reborn Jezebel. But Anne knew well her love with Henry, or more precisely, the power that love yielded was her only armor to climb to the throne. The irony was that once Anne became queen, that same love became her shackle. Henry, after years of passion, grew weary. The burden of producing a son weighed on Anne, and when she failed, love turned into cold fury. In a blink, Henry transformed, from ardent lover to merciless judge, signing her death warrant without hesitation. Yet remember, Anne's legacy did not lie in that tragic fate. She proved that royal love was no longer an accessory to politics, It could change politics. She forced the world to see a heart in love can beat so powerfully it shakes a throne, rewrite laws, and alters the history of a kingdom. Today, when people speak of Anne Boleyn, they often recall the scene of her beheading more than the moment of her coronation. But the shocking and strange truth is this: her love with Henry, though it ended in blood, opened a new era for England. It transformed royal marriage from a dry game of politics into a romantic tragedy the whole world could not look away from. And because of that, Anne forever became the woman who turned love into a battle of passion and power, a battle with the highest price in the history of the English monarchy. Fact number 11. Anne Boleyn and the chilling rumours of witchcraft, charms, and the devil's mark on her body. You know, in the 16th century, if someone hated you but could not find a legitimate reason to accuse you, the fastest way was to label you a witch, especially if you were a woman with intelligence, charm, and the courage to step outside the mold of obedience society had drawn for you. Then, condolences. You would soon be whispered about as having a pact with the devil, and Anne Boleyn, of course, did not escape that fate. From the moment Henry VIII became infatuated with Anne, political rivals murmured that she had used witchcraft to make the king so besotted. They could not believe that an ordinary woman could drive the most powerful monarch in Europe to abandon his wife, defy the Pope, and overturn the entire religious order. The simplest explanation: Anne was a witch. Some historians record that during Anne's trial, someone testified that she had a strange mark on her body, a mole, a small growth, or perhaps an extra finger. These details were inflated into a witch's mark, proof she had been bitten by the devil or had signed a blood pact with dark forces. Frightening as it sounds, in truth, everyone then had odd moles or minor birth defects. But once tied to the word witch, they became damning evidence against Anne. Others even spread the rumour that Anne had 3 breasts, or at least some unnatural swelling on her chest. It sounds like tavern gossip, but in a court determined to destroy Anne at all costs, such details became fact. The reasoning went, a woman with 3 breasts, surely that's to nurse devil's spawn. You might laugh now, but to 16th century England, it was reason enough to send a queen to the scaffold. And that was not all. Beyond the devil's mark, Anne was linked to Jezebel, the wicked woman of the Bible, symbol of lust and rebellion. Clergy thundered that Anne was Jezebel reborn, leading England to ruin. In sermons, her name was pronounced as a curse. Another curious detail: Anne had a sharp sense of fashion, often wearing unusual headpieces that concealed nearly all her hair, revealing only her face. This led to whispers that she wore them to hide horns. Absurd as it sounds, in a society both superstitious and bloodthirsty, such rumors spread with terrifying speed. Yet from a modern perspective, it is clear these so-called witch proofs were nothing but a smear campaign. Anne was too intelligent, too bold, too powerful to please the conservatives around her. And so, the only way to destroy her was to make her unnatural, a creature beyond humanity. So frightening that her removal seemed inevitable. Sadly, these rumors helped legitimize Anne's death sentence. When her head fell at the scaffold, many in the crowd whispered, "The witch has finally been punished." They did not see that Anne was no witch, but the victim of one of history's most ruthless smear campaigns. And perhaps, had Anne lived in our time, she would not have been called witch, but celebrated as a pioneer, a woman who dared to challenge male power, dared to live on her own terms, dared to pay the price for love and ambition. But tragically, in the 16th century, those qualities had only one name: witch. Fact number 12. Anne Boleyn, the woman who turned the Tudor court into a catwalk. If you think fashionistas only appeared in 20th century Paris or modern-day New York, then perhaps you should think again. As early as the 16th century, within the cold stone walls of the Tudor court, Anne Boleyn transformed herself into a fashion icon who made the entire court turn their heads and all of Europe whisper. Anne was not simply a beautiful woman. She understood the power of clothing and image in politics. In a court where every gaze was as sharp as a blade, a single gown, a strip of lace, or a jewel placed just right could silence enemies, win admiration from allies, and leave the king utterly captivated. Anne learned this secret during her time in France. While serving Queen Claude, she witnessed garments so exquisite that every stitch was a declaration of power. Anne brought all of that artistry back to England, wielding it like an invisible weapon. Unlike Catherine of Aragon, who favored the modest, somber Spanish style, Anne appeared in daring low-cut dresses, revealing her delicate collarbones and her long neck, which was considered highly alluring at the time. Today, such a look may seem tame, but in the 16th century, it was a true fashion shock. Some whispered she was shameless, but most simply could not look away. Most importantly, neither could Henry VIII. Anne became famous for her use of sheer lace, gold embroidery, and especially for her bold color choices. While most noble women chose muted tones to display solemnity, Anne wore crimson, emerald, and shimmering gold, colors bursting with life. Each time she entered a hall, the room seemed to light up, and every other lady nearby faded into the background. But perhaps Anne's most famous accessory was her necklace bearing the letter B. Her portraits often show her wearing it proudly. It was not just jewelry, it was a statement, "I am Anne Boleyn, and I am proud of my own name." In a society where women were defined by their husbands' families, Anne daring to display her own initial was revolutionary. Imagine a modern female politician walking into Parliament wearing a shirt that loudly declares, "I am different." Anne's style soon spread through the court. Ladies rushed to imitate her, from the French hood to tiered gowns, leaving Catherine of Aragon's outdated fashions behind. Thus, not only in love, but in fashion, Anne overthrew Catherine. Of course, this also bred enemies. Some conservative nobles saw Anne as a foreigner, bringing in French decadence. But the truth was, Anne knew image could kill or save. And in a court of intrigue, clothing was her shiniest armor. Some accounts even claim that Henry VIII boasted he had never seen anyone wear a dress as beautifully as Anne. For a man who loved grandeur, having a queen who dazzled both court and continent was a way of elevating himself as well. The irony is that when Anne fell to the scaffold, her enemies still sneered. She always dressed too boldly, as if she were daring the world. Yet it was precisely that boldness which ensured her immortality in memory. Search for images of any other Tudor queen, and then compare them with Anne. Only Anne Boleyn, with her bee necklace and piercing eyes, remains unforgettable. So, if this truth can be summed up in one sentence, it is this: Anne Boleyn was not just a victim of history. She was a 16th century fashion icon, the woman who turned the Tudor court into a runway, where she always shone as the brightest star. Fact number 13. Anne Boleyn, the woman who was not breathtakingly beautiful but made an entire kingdom fall in love in history. When we think of prominent female figures, we often imagine them as possessing beauty that could launch 1,000 ships, like Cleopatra or Helen of Troy. But Anne Boleyn was a strange exception. She was not a flawless beauty, even had a few unusual features. Yet she carried an irresistible magnetism strong enough to make the most powerful king in Europe turn an entire country upside down, just to have her. So, where did Anne's secret lie? First, it must be admitted that Anne did not fit the traditional Tudor standard of beauty. In the 16th century, the ideal look in England was porcelain white skin, golden hair, and clear blue eyes. Traits Catherine of Aragon and Jane Seymour possessed, Anne, by contrast, had darker skin, dark hair, and black or deep brown eyes. Some said her eyes were a little too sharp, her nose a little too long, and her face not as full as the standard of the time. Some sources even maliciously spread rumors that Anne had a large mole on her face, or even an extra finger on her hand. Although no solid evidence exists, such rumors were exaggerated by her enemies to tarnish her image. But as you see, outward beauty was only a small part. What made Anne truly dangerous was her aura and her intellect. It was said Anne had eyes that spoke, not because they sparkled like gems, but because of the way she looked at people. Her gaze was sharp, direct, bold enough to make a man feel challenged, yet soft enough to provoke curiosity. Perhaps you too have met someone like that in real life, not dazzlingly beautiful, but the moment their eyes swept across the room, everything seemed to brighten. That was Anne's energy. Beyond that, Anne possessed something many Tudor ladies lacked: intellectual charm. She was educated, spoke French, sang, played the lute, and knew French dances. When Anne conversed, she did not merely nod politely like other women. She debated. Arged, responded wittily. For Henry VIII, already bored of dull, courtly chatter, this was a refreshing breeze. Moreover, Anne mastered the art of distance. When Henry pursued her, she did not immediately fall into his arms like his previous mistresses. Instead, she skillfully balanced closeness and distance intimate enough to fuel Henry's burning desire, yet cool enough to make him wait. And it was this not-so-easily-won't quality that drove the king mad with longing. In other words, Anne Boleyn understood a timeless psychological truth. People crave what they cannot easily have. Interestingly, many contemporaries agreed that Anne was not beautiful in the absolute sense, but she possessed an attraction hard to define. Some called it charisma, others enchantment, and clearly, whatever name you give it, the result was the same. Henry VIII was willing to anger the Pope, divide Europe, and rewrite the religious map, all for Anne. Sadly, it was also this very magnetism that made Anne many enemies. Other ladies envied her, gentlemen resented her indifference, and conservatives saw her as a threat to traditional morals. They could not bear that a woman who was not perfectly beautiful, nor of royal blood, could unsettle an entire dynasty. And here lies the tragic paradox. The very allure that made Anne Boleyn a queen was the same that led her to the scaffold. Once Henry had conquered her, once curiosity turned into familiarity, that charm became the pretext for enemies to accuse her of bewitching, seducing, even witchcraft. But no matter the charges, posterity remembers Anne differently. She did not need to be the most beautiful. She was the one who made the whole world speak her name. And sometimes, that is a power far greater than any standard of beauty. Fact number 14. Anne Boleyn and the Witch's Shadow, when female power was branded as sorcery in the Tudor era. If a woman was intelligent, bold, and dared to challenge male order, sooner or later she would be labelled a witch. Anne Boleyn was a striking example of that injustice. Imagine this: a young woman who was neither a princess nor of royal blood, yet drove a powerful king like Henry VIII into obsession, abandoning his lawful wife, defying the Pope, and splitting the church. How would contemporaries explain it? To them, the most reasonable explanation was not Anne charmed him with her wit, but she used sorcery to bewitch the king. And so, from the moment Anne stepped into the light of politics, sinister rumors spread. People whispered that she carried a strange power in her gaze, that she owned charms learned from France, that her jewelry hid talismans. Some even swore she bore a mark of the devil, often described as a mole or an extra finger, exaggerated by her enemies. We must remember that 16th century Europe was in the bloody age of witch hunts. A single, unusual mark on the body could condemn a woman to the flames. Anne Boleyn, with all her difference and boldness, became a perfect target for the label. Ironically, Anne did have traits that fueled these rumors. Her eyes were indeed sharp, drawing people in while unsettling them. She carried an air of mystery, often dressed in black, and favored unusual accessories. To a superstitious crowd, this was evidence of sorcery. Yet behind those tales lies a deeper truth. To society then had no language to explain the soft power of women. In men, intellect and daring were praised. In women, the same qualities were branded unnatural. And what was unnatural, in the medieval mind, was easily equated with witchcraft. The climax came when Anne fell from favour. Henry VIII, once said to be blinded by her enchantments, now used that very idea to cut her down. Her political enemies spread stories that she consorted with the devil, that she lay with many men to conjure spells. Some venomous accounts even accused her of sleeping with her own brother as part of a dark ritual. You see, witch was not a vague insult. It was a political weapon to annihilate a woman's reputation. For Anne, it was the perfect excuse. She was not only betraying the king, she was endangering his soul and the realm. By that logic, her execution was justified to the public. One chilling detail when Anne was led to the scaffold. Some whispered that if she truly were a witch, the sword could never touch her neck. Of course, it was only superstition, but the fact such whispers spread shows how she had been cloaked in a veil of mystique and the supernatural even in life. Curiously, centuries later, the image of Anne the Witch became romanticized. In popular culture, she is often portrayed as half-queen, half-sorceress, both alluring and mysterious, as if she truly wielded some magic that could make men kneel. From film to novels to theatre, Anne has been drawn as a symbol of the art of enchantment. Though the truth was far more tragic, she was simply an intelligent woman born into the wrong age. Saying more deeply, this truth is not just Anne's story, but a reflection of an entire historical mechanism. Many powerful women, from Joan of Arc to Catherine de' Medici, were linked to charms or sorcery. It was how patriarchal society rationalized its fear of women. Anne was only one of the most famous victims. And you see, even after nearly 500 years, that witch's shadow still clings to her in collective memory. It is both an injustice and proof of her extraordinary influence. Thus, across centuries, Anne Boleyn's name still echoes in the cold corridors of history. She may have been dragged down into the mud of accusation, betrayal, and a wrongful death, but her memory was never buried. Anne is a paradox, both victim and game-changer, both a girl destroyed by love and a woman who dared to step where none had dared before. Perhaps she never practiced sorcery, as they said, but her intellect and resolve were, to Tudor society, no less than a kind of magic strong enough to shake a kingdom. Tonight, as you listen to this story, picture it in the flickering candlelight of old Greenwich Palace. A small figure in a black gown, sharp eyes fixed on the future. She knew each step could lead to the abyss, yet still she walked forward. That was Anne Boleyn, a woman destroyed, yet made immortal in humanity's memory. And perhaps, somewhere, history is still whispering those who dare to love, to live, to challenge fate will never truly vanish. Now, you may let your shoulders relax, take a deep breath, and allow your eyes to close. Outside, the world may be loud, full of disputes and ruins, but in your sleep tonight, only the whispers of history will remain. Soft as the wind, may you rest deeply, peacefully. Good night, and see you in the next story.